I'm sorry, I can't afford a Valentine's dinner, she apologized on a blind date. What the single dad did next left her in tears. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Tessa Monroe sat in her beat-up 2009 Honda Civic in the parking lot of Bella Vista on February 14th, staring at the restaurant through her cracked windshield and doing mental math that was making her physically nauseous. And she'd already Googled the menu prices 3 times, trying to convince herself this was doable. But the numbers kept coming back the same. Entrees starting at $28, which meant with tax and tip she was looking at minimum $40 she absolutely did not have. Her bank account currently had $63.17 until payday on Friday, and that had to cover gas to get to her teaching job in Denver and groceries for the week. And she was sitting here on a Valentine's Day blind date her friend Jenna had set up, wondering why she'd agreed to this when she could barely afford to exist, let alone pretend to be a functional adult who could casually drop $50 on dinner. The truly humiliating part was Tessa had a master's degree in education and worked as a third-grade teacher at a public elementary school, which sounded impressive until you mentioned the salary was $45,000 a year in a city where rent for her tiny studio apartment was $1,400 a month. And between her crushing student loans from that fancy degree and helping pay her mom's medical bills for the chronic illness that had destroyed their family's finances, Tessa was living a version of poverty that came with the extra shame of being highly educated and completely broke. She'd almost canceled this date 4 times, had the text typed out and ready to send saying she was sick or her car broke down, or literally any excuse that didn't involve admitting she was a 29-year-old professional who couldn't afford a Valentine's dinner. But Jenna had been so excited about setting her up with Kyle, swearing he was different and kind and stable, and Tessa had thought maybe just this once she could fake being normal. She forced herself out of the car and walked into Bella Vista, which was decorated within an inch of its life with red roses and twinkle lights and couples gazing at each other over candlelit tables. And the hostess directed her to a booth near the back where a guy was already sitting looking at his phone. He looked up when she approached and smiled. Genuinely smiled, not that polite stranger smile. And Tessa's first thought was that Jenna hadn't lied about him being good-looking. Dark hair with a little gray at the temples, kind eyes, broad shoulders that suggested he worked with his hands, and her second thought was that he was about to witness her most mortifying moment ever. "Tessa, I'm Kyle. Really nice to meet you," he said, standing up to shake her hand, which felt refreshingly normal in a way that made her relax for about 30 seconds until the waiter appeared with menus. Tessa opened hers and felt her stomach drop straight through the floor because somehow the prices had gone up since she checked online. Entrees were now $32 to $45, and there was no way she could order anything on this menu without completely destroying her ability to buy groceries for the next week. Kyle was looking at his menu completely unbothered, commenting on how good the steak looked, and Tessa was trying to figure out if she could just order water and claim she'd eaten already when she realized that was even more humiliating than what she was about to do. "Kyle," Tessa interrupted before he could suggest appetizers, and her voice came out shaky in a way that made her hate herself. "I need to be really honest with you about something, and it's going to be super embarrassing. But I can't sit here and pretend, I'm sorry, but I can't afford a Valentine's dinner like this. I thought this place was cheaper when I looked it up, and I'm a teacher, and money's really tight right now. And I know that's a terrible thing to admit on a first date, but can we maybe go somewhere else? Or I can just get water and you can eat. I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out in one humiliated rush, and Tessa felt her face burning so hot she probably looked sunburned. And she couldn't bring herself to look at Kyle's face because she didn't want to see pity or judgment or that particular expression people got when they realized you were broke. She was preparing for him to either awkwardly offer to pay, which would make her feel like charity, or make some excuse and leave, which would at least end this nightmare quickly. But instead, Kyle did something completely unexpected. He smiled like she'd just told him good news and said, "Oh, thank God, I was hoping you'd say that. I absolutely hate overpriced Valentine's dinners. They're such a scam, and the food's never even that good." Tessa looked up in shock, and Kyle was already closing his menu and signaling the waiter. "There's a food truck area about 2 blocks from here. Best street tacos in Denver for like $5. You interested? Way better than anything on this menu, and we won't have to whisper over violin music. Tessa just stared at him, trying to process what was happening. You're not mad? You don't think I'm a complete disaster? And Kyle laughed. Mad? I'm relieved. I only picked this place because Jenna said you liked Italian food, and I Googled nice Italian restaurants. But I grew up eating food truck tacos, and honestly, that's more my speed anyway. Come on, let's get out of here. They stood up and walked out past all the perfectly dressed couples with their perfect Valentine's dinners, and Tessa felt like she could actually breathe for the first time since she'd parked her car, and Kyle held the door for her as they stepped out into the cold February night. The food truck area was 2 blocks away in this open lot with picnic tables and string lights, and about 6 different trucks serving everything from tacos to Thai food. And even though it was February in Denver and definitely too cold to be eating outside, there were still people bundled up at the tables, laughing and eating, and having way more fun than anyone at Bella Vista. Kyle ordered them tacos from his favorite truck, refused to let Tessa pay, even though she offered, said, I invited you out, this one's on me, and we're talking $10, not 50, so please, just let me. And they grabbed a picnic table as far from the propane heaters as possible since those spots were taken. So, Kyle said once they were settled with their food, want to tell me why a teacher with a master's degree is worried about the price of dinner? Or is that too personal for a first date? His tone was gentle, not judgmental, and Tessa found herself telling him the truth in a way she never did with anyone. About the student loans that would outlive her, about her mom's medical bills from the autoimmune disease that required expensive treatment, about living in Denver on a teacher's salary that hadn't kept up with the cost of literally anything. I have a master's degree and I'm broke. Like actually broke, not exaggerating for sympathy broke. And it's so humiliating because I did everything right. I went to college, I got the degree, I work a respectable job, and I can't afford basic things. I feel like such a failure. Kyle was quiet for a minute, and then he said something that made Tessa's eyes burn. The shame is worse than being broke. I remember that feeling. I grew up in poverty, like real poverty. Single mom working 3 jobs, and some weeks we didn't have food. And the worst part wasn't being hungry, it was being ashamed that we were hungry. Tessa looked at him and saw understanding in his face, not pity. Trade school saved my life. I became an electrician, no college debt, good union wages, and I've been stable for years now. But I still remember what it felt like to be the kid with holes in his shoes. And I see that same shame in your eyes when you talk about money. And Tessa, you shouldn't feel that way. You're a teacher. You're literally shaping kids' futures. The fact that we don't pay teachers enough to live is a system failure, not your failure. They talked for 3 hours sitting at that freezing cold picnic table. And somewhere around hour 2, Tessa realized she'd completely forgotten it was Valentine's Day. Forgotten to be embarrassed. Forgotten to perform being someone she wasn't. And Kyle told her about his daughter Bria, who was 9 and obsessed with reading. And Tessa told him about her 3rd graders and the kid who brought her dandelions every day. And by the time they finally stood up to leave, Tessa's feet were numb from the cold, but her chest felt warm in a way it hadn't in years. Kyle walked her to her car, and before she could overthink it, Tessa said, "Thank you for not making me feel like garbage about the money thing. Everyone else I've ever dated has either been weird about it or made me feel like a charity case." And Kyle just smiled. "Thank you for being honest. I've been on way too many dates where people pretend to be someone they're not. This was the most real conversation I've had in forever." 3 weeks after their food truck Valentine's date, Tessa and Kyle had fallen into a routine that felt easy in a way dating had never felt before, and all their dates were deliberately cheap because Tessa had been upfront about her budget, and Kyle seemed genuinely fine with movie nights at his place instead of theaters, cooking dinner together instead of restaurants, and taking Bria to free museum days on Sundays instead of expensive weekend trips. Kyle never made Tessa feel bad about money, never offered to pay for things in that condescending way some guys did, where it was less about generosity and more about proving they could afford what you couldn't. And for the first time in her adult life, Tessa felt like she could just exist without performing financial stability she didn't have. Meeting Bria had been terrifying in that way that meeting someone's kid always is, because you know if the kid doesn't like you, the whole thing is basically doomed. But Bria had walked into Kyle's living room where Tessa was nervously sitting on the couch, looked her up and down with the brutal honesty of a 9-year-old, and announced, "Dad said you're a teacher and you like books. I'm reading Percy Jackson right now, and I have questions about Greek mythology." Tessa had spent the next 2 hours discussing gods and monsters with a kid who read at a 7th grade level and asked questions that would have impressed her college professors. And by the time Bria went to bed, she'd declared Tessa actually cool for a grown-up, which Kyle said was the highest compliment his daughter had ever given anyone. Everything was going almost suspiciously well until Tessa's teacher friends met Kyle, and it happened at a happy hour that Tessa had been trying to skip, but her work friend Rachel had insisted, saying everyone wanted to meet the new guy Tessa wouldn't shut up about. Kyle had shown up straight from a job site in his work jeans and company shirt, with his name embroidered on the chest, and Tessa watched her colleagues take him in with these polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The kind of smiles educated people give when they're trying not to be obviously judgmental. The conversation had been fine if slightly stilted until Rachel asked what Kyle did for work. And when he said he was an electrician, Tessa saw something shift in the group dynamic, this almost imperceptible pulling back like they just recategorized him in their heads. Later that night after Kyle left, Rachel had pulled Tessa aside with wine-loosened honesty and said, "He seems really nice. It's just interesting that you're with someone who does manual labor when you're so educated. I mean, you have a master's degree. Don't you want someone on your level intellectually?" Tessa had felt her stomach twist because she knew Rachel meant well in that oblivious way privileged people often do. But the comment hit wrong, made her feel like she was betraying something by dating Kyle, even though Kyle was one of the smartest people she'd ever met, just in ways that didn't come with a college degree. She'd defended him, said intelligence wasn't measured by education, but the seed of doubt had been planted. This nagging question about whether her world and his world could actually coexist, or if she was kidding herself. The flip side happened 2 weeks later when Tessa met Kyle's electrician crew at a union barbecue. And she dressed casual but still somehow looked like exactly what she was, a teacher, and Kyle's buddy Derek had taken one look at her and made some joke about Kyle dating up, getting himself a classy educated girlfriend, with this tone that wasn't quite friendly. The other guys had laughed and made comments about Tessa probably reading books for fun and using big words. And even though they were joking, there was an edge to it, like they were testing to see if she thought she was too good for them. And Tessa had felt completely out of place in a way she hadn't expected, like she was being judged for having a degree in a space where degrees were seen as pretentious. Kyle had noticed her discomfort on the drive home and asked if she was okay, and Tessa had tried to articulate the weird class tension she'd felt without sounding like she was criticizing his friends. "It's like they assumed I looked down on them because I went to college. But I don't. I feel caught between two worlds where one side thinks I'm dating down and the other thinks I'm stuck up, and I don't know how to exist in that middle space." Kyle had gone quiet, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and Tessa realized she'd hit on something he'd been feeling too. This unspoken tension neither of them knew how to name. The real issue wasn't actually about him versus her. It was about the shame they both carried around, class and money in completely different ways, and it took Tessa weeks to understand that. She was ashamed of being broke despite her education, felt like a failure because she'd followed all the rules and still ended up drowning in debt while Kyle had stability and savings despite never going to college. And that comparison made her feel like her expensive degree had been worthless. Meanwhile, Kyle carried his own shame about not having formal education. Sometimes felt less than when Tessa's teacher friends talked about their graduate programs or referenced books he'd never read. And even though he made good money and owned his own home, he couldn't shake the feeling that people like Tessa's colleagues saw him as just a guy who worked with his hands. They didn't talk about any of this directly, just let it simmer under the surface, making everything slightly tense, until Tessa's car died in the middle of March and forced everything into the open in the worst possible way. She'd been driving home from school when her engine started making a sound, like a dying animal. And by the time she limped into a mechanic shop, the diagnosis was $1,200 in repairs that needed to happen immediately, or the car was basically totaling itself. Tessa had sat in the mechanic's waiting room doing math that didn't work. She had maybe 400 in her account after rent. The rest was earmarked for student loans and her mom's medication copays. And there was no universe where she could come up with $1,200 without destroying her already precarious financial situation. She called Kyle from the shop because he was the person she called when things went wrong now, and he'd shown up within 20 minutes. Talked to the mechanic about what was actually critical versus what could wait, got the price down to $900 for the essentials, and then turned to Tessa and said, "I'll cover it. You can pay me back whenever. No rush. I just don't want you without a car." Tessa had felt this immediate visceral reaction, gratitude mixed with humiliation, mixed with anger she couldn't quite explain. And she'd said, "I can't let you do that." And Kyle had looked confused. "Why not? I have the money. You need your car to get to work. This is a practical solution." But it wasn't just practical to Tessa. It was him having something she desperately needed, and her being dependent on him for it. And all the class shame she'd been carrying for years came pouring out in the mechanic shop parking lot. "Because then I owe you money, Kyle, and owing you money means we're not equals. It means I'm the broke girlfriend you have to take care of, and I can't be that person. I've spent my entire adult life trying not to be a burden." And her voice was shaking, and Kyle's expression shifted from confused to hurt. "You help your mom with her medical bills. You give money to your school kids when they need supplies. But you won't let me help you. That's not about pride, Tessa. That's about you not trusting me." The fight escalated right there with mechanics walking around them. Tessa saying she couldn't be in a relationship where she was financially dependent. Kyle saying she was so ashamed of needing help, she'd rather suffer than accept it. And it ended with Tessa saying, "Maybe we need to take a break until I figure my life out." And Kyle saying, "Maybe you're right," in a voice that sounded like she'd just broken something important. And Tessa had called an Uber home and left her car at the shop because she literally couldn't afford to fix it or to accept help fixing it. And the whole situation felt like proof that she'd been right to be terrified about money destroying this relationship. 2 weeks of silence followed, and Tessa was absolutely miserable. Biking to school in March cold because her car was still sitting unfixed at the mechanic, and her students kept asking why she looked so sad, and she wanted to explain that she'd pushed away someone amazing because her pride and shame about money had convinced her that accepting help made her weak. But how do you explain class consciousness and internalized capitalism to 8-year-olds? So she just said she was tired and tried not to cry at her desk during lunch. 2 weeks of silence felt like 2 years to Tessa, and she spent that entire time biking to school in March cold because her car was still sitting at the mechanic collecting dust and probably more repair fees. And every single day, her third graders would ask why she looked so sad, and she'd have to paste on a smile and say something about allergies, while internally she was falling apart over pushing away the best relationship she'd had in years, because her pride and shame about money had convinced her that accepting help made her less than. Her mentor teacher, Mrs. Chen, had finally cornered her in the staff room on a Friday afternoon when Tessa was grading papers with tears running down her face. And Mrs. Chen had sat down across from her with that look teachers get when they're about to deliver some hard truth you desperately need to hear. "You want to tell me why you've been crying into student essays for 2 weeks? Or should I just guess it's about that electrician boyfriend you won't stop not talking about?" Mrs. Chen had asked, and Tessa had broken down completely, told her everything about the car and the fight and how she couldn't accept Kyle's help because it would make them unequal. And Mrs. Chen had listened without interrupting until Tessa ran out of words. "Can I tell you something you're not going to want to hear?" Mrs. Chen had said gently. "You're not protecting your independence by refusing help. You're punishing yourself for being poor. And Tessa, that's internalized classism. You've bought into this idea that needing help makes you a failure, when really it just makes you human. And pushing away someone who actually understands that struggle because you're ashamed? That's not strength. That's fear." Those words had hit Tessa like cold water, and she'd sat there in the staff room realizing Mrs. Chen was right. She'd been so consumed by shame about not being financially stable, despite doing everything right, that she'd made poverty her entire identity. And when Kyle had offered help, she'd heard pity instead of partnership, had assumed he saw her as broken instead of considering he might just see her as someone he loved who needed support. She'd gone home that night and stared at her phone for 2 hours trying to figure out how to text Kyle an apology that could fix what she'd broken. But every message she typed sounded hollow and insufficient, and she'd finally fallen asleep with her phone in her hand and no idea how to bridge the gap she'd created. Meanwhile, Kyle was going through his own reckoning, and it had started with his mom showing up unannounced at his house on a Tuesday evening after Bria had mentioned at dinner with Grandma that Tessa wasn't coming around anymore. His mom had walked into his kitchen, taken one look at his face, and said, "You want to tell me why you look like someone kicked your dog? Or should I just assume it's about the teacher?" Kyle had tried to brush it off, said it was complicated, but his mom wasn't having it. She'd raised him as a single parent in poverty and had a built-in detector for when he was being stupid about something important. "Let me guess," she'd said while making herself tea in his kitchen like she owned the place. "She needed something. You offered money. She got mad. You got defensive. Now you're both miserable, and neither of you will apologize because you're both too stubborn." Kyle had been stunned by how accurate that was, and his mom had continued, "Here's what you're not seeing. When you offered to pay for her car, you weren't offering help. You were trying to fix her. And there's a difference. Help is asking what someone needs and respecting their answer. Fixing is deciding you know better than they do what they need. And baby, you grew up poor. You remember how it felt when people with money tried to fix us like we were broken?" Kyle had felt that land in his chest because, yeah, he remembered the church ladies who'd brought Christmas presents with pity in their eyes, remembered the school counselor who talked about his potential like it was shocking that a poor kid could be smart, and he realized with horrible clarity that he'd done the same thing to Tessa, had assumed his financial stability made him the hero of her story instead of recognizing she'd been surviving impossible circumstances with grace and strength he couldn't even imagine. His mom had left him with one more piece of wisdom. That girl doesn't need you to save her. She needs you to see her, to recognize that being broke while working a job that matters and supporting her mother and paying off debt from trying to better herself, that's not failure, Kyle. That's quiet heroism. And if you can't see that, then you don't deserve her. Kyle had spent the next couple days thinking about what his mom said, about how Tessa had seemed ashamed when she'd talked about money that first night at the food truck, about how she'd called herself a failure for being poor. And he'd realized that what she needed wasn't his money. It was someone to tell her she wasn't broken, that her worth wasn't measured by her bank account, and he'd made a plan that was either going to fix everything or make it infinitely worse. Thursday afternoon, Kyle showed up at Tessa's elementary school with Bria in tow, and he'd timed it for right after the last bell when students were leaving, and Tessa would still be in her classroom doing that after-school work teachers do that nobody sees or appreciates. He found her at her desk surrounded by student projects and lesson plans, and when she looked up and saw him standing in her doorway, her face did something complicated, surprise and hope and fear all mixed together. "Kyle, what are you doing here?" Tessa's voice came out small, and Kyle walked into the classroom with Bria holding his hand. And he'd practiced this speech so many times in his truck, but now that he was here, all the words felt inadequate. "I'm here to apologize," Kyle said, "not for offering money, but for thinking you needed saving, for acting like my financial stability made me some kind of hero in your story, instead of recognizing that you're the strongest person I've ever met." Tessa's eyes were already filling with tears, and Kyle kept going, "You're not broken, Tessa. You're a third-grade teacher making poverty wages while paying off debt from a degree that society told you was necessary, while supporting your mom through a chronic illness, while showing up every day for kids who need you, and you're doing all of that without complaining or giving up or asking for handouts. That's not failure. That's incredible strength. And I'm sorry I couldn't see it clearly enough to tell you that when it mattered." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "I can't fix your car situation or your student loans or the fact that teachers are criminally underpaid, but I wanted to give you something that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with how I see you." Tessa unwrapped it with shaking hands and found a wooden bookmark, intricately carved with flowers and her initials. The kind of craftsmanship that came from hours of careful work, and Kyle explained, My mom taught me to carve these when I was a kid, and we couldn't afford Christmas presents. This one took me about 20 hours over the past few days. It's not worth anything monetarily, but it's made specifically for you because you deserve something beautiful that someone made just for you because you matter, Tessa. Not because of what you can afford or what degree you have, but because of who you are. Tessa completely broke down, sobbing in her classroom, while Bria looked worried and Kyle just held her. And through her tears, she managed to say, "No one has ever told me that being broke doesn't make me a failure. Everyone either pities me or judges me or tries to fix me. But you're the first person who's seen my struggle as strength instead of something wrong with me." Kyle held her tighter. "There's nothing wrong with you. The system is what's broken. You're just trying to survive it with dignity." And they stood there in her classroom holding each other while Bria wandered around looking at student artwork on the walls. When Tessa finally pulled herself together, she said, "I'm sorry, too, for being so proud I couldn't accept help, for making you feel like offering support meant you thought I was weak. I've been carrying shame about money for so long, I can't tell the difference between charity and partnership anymore." Kyle cupped her face gently. "So let's figure it out together. Let's talk about money and class and all the stuff people pretend doesn't matter, but actually matters a lot. Because Tessa, I don't want to lose you over something we can work through." They sat down at Tessa's desk while Bria colored with markers at a student table, and they had the most honest conversation they'd ever had about class and money and shame and pride and what equality actually meant when two people came from different financial circumstances. Kyle suggested she could borrow money for the car with a written payment plan if that would make her feel better. And Tessa admitted that actually would help because it would feel like a loan between equals instead of charity. And they talked about how his trade work didn't make him less educated, it made him differently educated, and how her degree didn't make her better. It just made her broke with a piece of paper. And they both acknowledged that they were equals, just in completely different ways. And that was okay. That was actually beautiful if they could both stop carrying shame about their different circumstances. 7 months later, they were back at the same food truck area from their first date. And it was October now, so at least they weren't freezing. And Bria was with them, scarfing down tacos and talking about the book she just finished. Tessa had paid back every penny of the car repair in small monthly installments. And even though Kyle had told her multiple times she didn't have to, she'd insisted because it made her feel like she was contributing equally to the relationship. And Kyle had learned that sometimes accepting someone's pride was its own form of respect. Tessa still struggled financially, still lived paycheck to paycheck, still had crushing student loans. But she'd stopped carrying shame about it, had started being honest with people about teacher poverty instead of pretending she was fine, and somehow owning her reality instead of hiding it had made the whole thing more bearable. Kyle had started taking some business classes at community college because he wanted to eventually start his own electrical contracting company, and Tessa had helped him with his essays and study guides, and he'd stopped feeling less than because he was learning from his girlfriend, who had a master's degree, had started seeing her education as a resource they could share instead of a marker of her being better than him. They'd found this middle ground where his stability helped cushion her financial stress without making her dependent, and her intellectual world had opened up perspectives he'd never had access to, and they both stopped measuring worth by dollars or degrees and started measuring it by the life they were building together. Sitting at that picnic table with Bria stealing fries off both their plates, Kyle reached across and took Tessa's hand. "Remember when you apologized for not being able to afford Valentine's dinner?" And Tessa laughed. "You mean the most humiliating moment of my life?" "Yeah, I remember." Kyle squeezed her fingers. "That was the moment I knew you were different, that you were real. Most people spend first dates pretending to be someone they're not, but you just put all your cards on the table. And Tessa, that vulnerability, that's what I fell in love with. Not despite your struggles, but because you were brave enough to be honest about them. Sometimes love isn't about who has more money or more education or more stability. Sometimes it's about who sees your worth when you can't see it yourself, who recognizes your struggle as strength instead of weakness, who meets you exactly where you are instead of where they think you should be. Tessa had walked into that Valentine's dinner terrified that being poor made her unworthy of love, and Kyle had shown her that worth isn't measured in bank accounts or degrees. It's measured in how you show up for the people who matter, in the quiet heroism of surviving systems that were never designed for you to succeed, in the courage it takes to be vulnerable enough to say, I'm struggling and I need help. If this story reminded you that financial shame is real and class matters, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't afford dinner, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've ever felt ashamed about money. We love hearing your stories. Thanks for being here with us. And remember that being broke doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. And the right person will see your strength exactly where you thought you only had weakness.